Alright guys, today I want to talk to you about damage in Diablo 4. Mainly, what are these so-called damage buckets that everybody talks about? How do you utilize them? And which ones should you worry about moving forward? There are a few places where you can go find this information, but sometimes it's a little convoluted and a little bit hard to read. I felt like I would just explain to you my understanding of it and try to do things in an easy, cut and dry fashion that you can follow along and make sense. So if you look at our spreadsheet here, there are about 8 different damage buckets on the sheet, but that's kind of a little bit misleading. There's really only about 5 buckets on here, with the other 3 being sort of your base damage, your class stats, and your weapons attack speed. Now, the first 3, the base damage, your class stat, and your attack speed, are ones that are a little bit more static. So for these, I've kind of went down and wrote down just a little bit of info on here to kind of help sort of clarify what we're looking at. So for your base damage, this would be your weapons damage or your thorns damage or anything like that. Anything that it just outputs a specific amount of damage. On top of that, if it has a skill modifier, the skill modifier goes after the base damage, right? So if your weapon has a base damage of say 600 and the skill you're getting ready to use has a multiplier of 35% of that damage, in theory, you would do around 210 damage every time you use that skill. Keep in mind, this is only for like academic purposes, and this doesn't take into account a whole lot of other factors. Moving past there, after you have the base damage of your skill, it's going to go through your class stat. So each class has a primary stat. That stat will modify your skill's damage or your base damage. Now, the modification for that is about 10%, right? So if you have 262 dexterity on a rogue, you will get roughly 10% of that in your equation. So for this, we're saying that if we have 600 damage weapon and the skill modifier is 35%, we have 262 dexterity. The skill we use should output around 5,000 damage. Then it has to go through armor and all sorts of other things. So these are sort of your first 2 things that you can control in your character. After that, you have your weapons attack speed. So your attack speed isn't a direct modifier on this number, but it's just how many times you can do that per second. And that's going to modify sort of this as it moves forward, right? So if you can attack twice in a second, then you'll do 10,000 damage. If you can only attack half of an attack in 1 second, then you'll do half of that, 2,500 damage, right? We're just doing quick math. So these are ones that are pretty much dictated by you, your class, and the weapon you're using, or if you're using thorns or something like that. After you get through that, we start getting into the actual buckets. These are the things you need to pay attention to, because not all of them are created equal. The first bucket you need to be aware of is the additive damage bucket. This one adds damage to your attacks instead of multiplying your attacks by a percent. Normally you'll find a lot of this on gear, and this is going to be like added damage versus crowd controlled enemies, added damage versus frozen enemies, added damage versus X. So this bucket collects all of those, and they all go in one time. And it takes your damage, and then it adds whatever percent of damage that is to the equation. This is actually a very large bucket, and it catches most of all of these sort of perks that you'll see on your gear. The next one we have is a multiplicative bucket. Now this one you'll see mainly in your stat tree and stuff like that, where it says you do a percent of bonus damage to a frozen target in this sense, or versus a certain type. There aren't a lot of these, and most of this will be in your skill tree or your paragon, and it will say times and not plus. That is the big difference. Anything that says times, not plus, goes in this bucket. If it says plus, it goes in the additive bucket. There's too many things to list. I'm not going to list them all. All you need to know is that there's an additive bucket and a multiplicative bucket, and those are separate buckets. Out of the 2 of these buckets, you would want to prioritize the multiplicative bucket over the additive bucket, but there's not as many opportunities to really work on the multiplicative bucket. So now that we've explained the additive and the multiplicative, now we're getting to sort of some of the more important buckets. That being critical, vulnerable. Overpowered is on this list, but we'll talk about why it's less important here in a minute. The critical bucket is a multiplicative damage type. So it will take whatever your damage is after you get through your additive and your multiplicative, and it will multiply your damage based on this percent. This is where things start to get pretty crazy in damage numbers. So say you have 1,000 damage by the time you get here, and the crit bucket does 300% damage. Well, you're going to take 300% times that 1,000, and that's going to be your number. So crit is one of those things that everybody wants to build into, and I highly suggest almost every build you have, try to build into crit because it is multiplicative. Crit can be a little bit tough to build into because it is so strong. There aren't a lot of options to get your crit chance up super high to make it to where this procs all the time. The next bucket is the vulnerable bucket. The vulnerable bucket is really good because there are a lot of skills in Diablo 4 that allow you to make a target vulnerable. This is one of the few things you can pretty much almost guarantee your enemy is feeling. Vulnerable also has a 20% base damage increase flat out. Without you doing anything at all, you will do 20% more damage to a vulnerable target than a regular target. On top of that, you can add a lot of increased damage multipliers to this vulnerable. This is one thing that every build should focus on because almost every character in the game can proc vulnerable and keep the target vulnerable for an extended period of time. Out of all of the buckets, vulnerable is probably the most important because it's the easiest to build into and it's the easiest to proc. Overpowered is actually a lot harder because overpowered only has a 3% base chance to proc, and only a couple classes have great ways to guarantee that overpowered hits. So unless your class really specializes in overpowered damage, I would treat this as a very unimportant bucket. Less important than crit, but probably more important than some of your additive buckets. The main reason is because it's still multiplicative. The damage you will get from an overpowered attack will multiply out, and that is better than the damage from the additive bucket adding on. At low levels, it's not going to matter that much, but at the higher levels, anytime you can take a number and multiply it versus a number and add it, the multiply is normally going to be bigger once the numbers get large enough. All right, so that was like a whole lot of words, and we need to cut this down into something that's easy to digest, right? What you really need to know is every build can and will sort of benefit from focusing on vulnerable builds and the vulnerable bucket. After that, you should focus on criticals, critical chance, and the critical bucket. Once you have both of those as good as you can, look at trying to do things in the multiplicative bucket unless your character specializes in overpowered. If your character specializes in overpowered, build into overpowered. If not, try to get things in your multiplicative bucket. Anything that says it does X times damage. After that, if you have more damage, more places you can build damage in, add it to your additive bucket. Those are realistically all the main buckets in the game. Everything other than that, your base damage, your class stat, and your attack speed, those should be focused on as you can get upgrades for them, but they're a little bit harder to build into, right? And the last thing I want to talk about is actually these things over here, which are the color codes in game. Now, this isn't really going to change your game, but it is going to help you sort of see what's going on so you can see how many times your sort of attacks are proccing, and you can feel your percents to tell if, hey, you know, I'm hitting more criticals than what I was before with this build. A lot of that's going to come from these color codes. What you need to know is that a base attack will always show up white. If you hit, it's going to show up as a white number. If you get a critical in Diablo 4, it actually shows up as a yellow number. Not a big deal, right? There are no red crits in Diablo. If you score an overpowered hit, an overpowered hit is going to show up blue. These are going to be rare in most builds, but you need to be aware of, hey, that's what that was. And if you get lucky enough to hit an overpowered crit, it's going to show up orange. So this will help you when you see big numbers to know where they're coming from and to know reliably how often they're going to pop up. All right, guys, hopefully this helps you understand sort of the damage buckets in Diablo 4 and where you should focus on adding damage to your builds. There's a lot of information out there, like we said, and and it can be hard to wade through it. So hopefully this helps and helps you improve your damage output and makes your life easier in Sanctuary. If you've enjoyed this video, consider checking out some of the other videos on our channel. And as always, have a great day.